Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Brown and welcome back to my corner. Today's themes of discussion are economy, regulations, the Great Depression, and COVID-19, because who isn't tired about hearing about that? Let's get into today's topic of discussion. Today we will be trying to answer the question of how much should the government regulate the economy based on what we've seen from the Great Depression and the COVID-19 recession. Ever since the infamous Great Depression, the United States government has demonstrated its lacking ability to properly regulate the economy on its own. Starting there, the government has proven itself to be unreliable based on slow response time during the Great Depression, them not listening to economists during the Great Depression, and raising taxes during the Great Depression. And currently, with COVID, the government's responses haven't gotten any better since there are still staggering amounts of unemployment. Therefore, the United States government is still able to regulate taxes and regulate tariff trade and have the Federal Reserve, but I believe that it shouldn't be allowed to do any of that without consulting and having experts like economists on hand and a part of Congress and a part of the Federal Reserve System and any kind of board that has to deal with economy. So for a little bit of an explanation, the Federal Reserve is a system set in place that can loan out money and such, and it is part of the government, especially back then, that was meant to help regulate the economy. Now I bet you're wondering, what do they have to do with this? Well, their response time was slow when they were trying to fix, the Great Depression that just happened and the bank crashes. See, the banks crashing should have garnered a quick response, but it didn't. And I bet you're wondering, did the Federal Reserve do their job? Was it some other thing? No! The Federal Reserve did not do their job. See, all the banks that crashed first were smaller banks and larger banks that were not a part of the Federal Reserve System, meaning they could not borrow money to give out to people that were coming in to take all of their money out. So in 1929, when this was all happening, banks needed to loan out money to give to patrons who were trying to take out their entire accounts at once because they were afraid that all their money would be gone. And it wasn't until after this that the Federal Reserve was like, hey, these banks don't have enough physical money to give out. Maybe we should finally help them. But by that point, irreversible damage had been done and the Great Depression had been kickstarted. Therefore, this is all leading to the fact that I think that federal systems like the Federal Reserve should not be allowed to act this poorly and this slowly, especially when they are responsible for holding the nation's banking system and economy together. See, the Federal Reserve was acting recklessly, and maybe they didn't know that at the time, but history later on will show that they reacted very poorly and very slowly, and maybe the Great Depression could have been a little less worse if they had actually done their job. So during the same time of inaction by the Federal Reserve, something called the Smoot-Hawley tariff was introduced. Now, what the Smoot-Hawley tariff was meant to do was protect agricultural businesses and protect big businesses from foreign competition. Now, based on what you've heard me say before, I bet you're guessing where this is going by now. It didn't turn out how it worked. In fact, it ended up raising imports worldwide and tanking the small trade system that the US had created. Even though technically it was a closed economy and the trade deficit did not hit them that badly, it was still a contributor to the devastation that was the Great Depression. How did it get this bad, though? That's the question. And it was because the government, specifically President Hoover and Congress, did not listen to hundreds of economists that had signed a petition and had told them that the Smoot-Hawley tariff would not do what they were expecting it to. So the Smoot-Hawley tariff obviously did much more harm than good because the government was too focused on their overwhelming power and trying to fix things and trying to appease businesses that they did not listen to actual experts on the topic. And not listening to economic experts was one decision, just one decision, made by the government during that time that proves it was unable to regulate the economy by itself. And that's still going on. The government does not have economists on any kind of panel. So once again, more partial blame falls onto President Hoover because he signed in the Revenue Act of 1932, the first few years of the Great Depression. This act was made in an attempt to balance the federal budget and fix, the national credit system. It raised the top income tax from 25% to 63%. That's quite a lot. That's over half. That's one of the largest income tax raises in recent history. But it was raised because the Treasury had a deficit of funds because, the Great Depression, people took out all their money, stocks crashed, they took all their money out, and basically the Treasury didn't have the sufficient funds. And, raising these taxes would have been a decent idea if the entire country was not in an economic crisis, as to begin with. See, it's common knowledge that most people, lost their jobs, meaning that they couldn't pay these taxes. So President Hoover, made an act for taxes to be raised while people did not have the money to pay these taxes. Basically, Hoover raised taxes at one of the worst economic times in history to fix one of the most terrible economic times in history, which, when you add it up, it doesn't really make sense. And then due to the government's overarching control and everything, they made a bad decision when they thought it would make something better, when obviously if they had thought it through a little bit longer, it wouldn't have. And Hoover wasn't the only one to raise taxes during this time. The president after him, FDR, did the same. So just after 1932, in about 1933-1934, President Franklin D. Roosevelt created something called the New Deal. It was a series of acts and programs that was meant to lessen the 25% unemployment rate of the Great Depression. One of these acts was the Federal Emergency Relief Act, which gave grants to struggling businesses. Now, of course, these grants had to come from somewhere. These grants had to come from the American public. But of course, the American public, as we just saw with Hoover, didn't have the money to pay these taxes. The money had to come from somewhere, but the government didn't have the money, so it had to tax its citizens. So Congress had to give approval to both of these, at different times without the influence of economists, which led to more issues than were present beforehand. And so, therefore, what I think is that if the government is too big, then of course there's more public funding that's needed. But if the public is unable to provide these funds, then the government needs more internal regulation to notice the fact that the public cannot fund any of these programs or tax raises that they're trying to make. The government's ability to regulate the economy has not improved in nearly a century. At least its ability to regulate unemployment hasn't. So let's take a look at comparing the Great Depression to the current COVID-19 recession. So let's compare the first quarter of each time period of their unemployment. So in the first couple months of the Great Depression, the unemployment rate was at 4%. But in the first couple months of COVID, the unemployment rate was 15%. So obviously they have unemployment, combined. But of course, we have to take into account that the Great Depression did not have the mandated shutdowns that the COVID-19 recession had. But that's still no excuse for the fact that the government was not able to offer a good response or a solid economic plan for either of these economic downfalls. So, as we look at the Depression and COVID, it's might be a little bit difficult to compare the two completely because of one's a pandemic and one is a strictly more economic type of base kind of thing. But even if we're just to compare, 15% in a couple months compared to 4%, even if we didn't have the shutdowns and it was just an economic crash, I'm still certain that it would still be higher than the 4% that the Great Depression had. And it shows how the U.S. government has gotten worse in its response and handling. In addition, by state, most states in the U.S. currently have reached their all-time highs of unemployment. Of course, that plays into the whole no shutdown thing, but still, in double digits for the first time in upwards of 20 years since the 90s. That's crazy, to be honest. And of course, during both times, and as these results of the comparison show, the government could not offer the citizens a solid economic plan during either of them because they didn't have the people on board that should have been there, like economists. So maybe if the government had devised a better way to guide the country and guide the citizens, maybe the Depression could have been less worse, and maybe the COVID recession could have been less worse. So then, as old history and new history has shown, the federal United States government is incapable of regulating the economy on its own. Obviously, the United States government should still be able to regulate taxes and trade, but it should not be able to act on its lonesome because they cannot handle that. So to answer the question of how much the government should regulate the economy, I'd say that based on how it handled the Great Depression and the COVID-19 recession, it is safe to say that most government officials, don't know what they're talking about, and therefore economists should be at the forefront of any economic decision, but especially economic decisions that are going to affect the entire country. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you want to take a look at the essay that this is based on, you can go to the description and my sources will be there as well. Thank you.